Officer Wade Tolliver thought he was pulling over another quiet, powerless black man on a lonely mountain road. He had done it 100 times before. But by sunset that day, his badge would be sitting in an evidence bag. His police chief would be in handcuffs on the courthouse steps, and the town of Colter Falls would wake up the next morning to federal agents parked outside every door that mattered. The man he pulled over never raised his voice. He never reached for a weapon. He simply reached slowly, calmly, for something far more dangerous than a gun. He reached for the truth. Colter Falls sits in a fold of the Blue Ridge foothills, the kind of town that looks like a postcard if you don't look too closely. Stone bridges, a white church steeple, a lake so still in the morning that it mirrors the mountains like glass. Tourists come through on their way to somewhere else, and that has always been the town's real business. Not the bakery on Main Street, not the little bed and breakfast by the water. The real business of Colter Falls for almost a decade has been the 11 miles of two-lane highway that cuts through it, and the police department that treats that highway like a toll road nobody agreed to. If you were black or Latino, or drove a car with plates from 2 states away, and you passed through Colter Falls at the wrong hour, there was a good chance you would meet Officer Wade Tolliver before you ever saw the lake. Tolliver was 38 years old, built like a man who spent more time in the gym than on patrol, with a jaw he liked to set hard for dash cams and a laugh he saved for other officers only. He had been with the Colter Falls Police Department for 11 years, long enough to know exactly which roads had no witnesses, exactly which judge would sign off on a search without asking questions, and exactly which drivers were the safest kind of target. Not the ones who would fight back in court. The ones who would rather pay the fine and leave than risk their trip, their business meeting, their vacation, their life, by arguing with a man wearing a badge and a loaded weapon. He had learned that skill from the man who built the whole system, Chief Roy Danvers. Ask anyone who had lived in Colter Falls long enough, and they would tell you the same thing without quite saying it out loud. Everybody knew, and nobody said anything, because the ones who did usually found out just how small a small town could make your life. A shop owner on Main Street, who once complained publicly about a customer's car being towed for no reason, found his business hit with 3 surprise health inspections in a single month. A retired schoolteacher who wrote a letter to the county paper questioning the department's seizure numbers found her water bill mysteriously doubled for 6 months before anyone in the town office could look into it. The lesson landed the way it was meant to. In Colter Falls, you kept your head down, you paid your fines, and you thanked whatever you believed in that it wasn't worse. Danvers had run the Colter Falls Police Department for 16 years, and somewhere around year 4, he had stopped thinking of it as a police department and started thinking of it as a business. A small, private, extremely profitable business. It started small, a few unnecessary tows here, a cash seizure there, always technically inside the lines of civil asset forfeiture law, always just corrupt enough to make money and just legal enough to survive an audit. But over the years it had grown into something else entirely. A machine. The machine worked like this. Officers like Tolliver would stop out-of-town drivers for invented reasons. A taillight that wasn't actually broken, a lane change that wasn't actually illegal, an odor that wasn't actually there. Once the driver was out of the car, the officer would find a reason to search it. Once the car was searched, cash, jewelry, electronics, anything of value would be seized under the town's civil asset forfeiture program. On the theory that it was connected to a crime that never had to be proven because the driver was 300 miles from home and could not afford to fly back and fight it in Colter Falls Municipal Court. Then came the tow. Every seized vehicle went to one company, Ridge Line Towing and Recovery, conveniently owned by Chief Danvers's brother-in-law, Curtis Boone. Ridge Line charged storage fees that climbed by the day, fees no driver could realistically pay before their car was auctioned off, often to a buyer who, if you trace the paperwork far enough, turned out to be connected to Curtis Boone as well. The cash from the forfeitures and the auctions didn't go into a general town fund where anyone might ask questions. It moved through a private account tied to something called the Colter Falls Community Safety Foundation, a name that sounded like a charity and functioned like a slush fund. From there, money quietly funded the mayor's re-election campaigns, greased the wheels at the county courthouse, and lined pockets that had absolutely no business being lined. Mayor Denise Calloway had been in office for 3 terms, and every one of those terms had been financed, in part, by money that started as some stranger's stolen wages sitting in a glove compartment on Route 9. She told herself she didn't know the details. She told herself a lot of things. Judge Preston Hale sat on the municipal bench and signed off on search warrants that should never have been signed, approved forfeiture orders in minutes rather than the weeks they deserved, and dismissed the rare complaint that made it to his courtroom with the practiced boredom of a man who had done this 1,000 times and expected to do it 1,000 more. And County Prosecutor Ray Vance, when a case against the department ever threatened to surface, was remarkably good at finding reasons it didn't need to move forward. A missing witness, a technicality, a quiet word in a hallway. Vance liked his job, liked his house on the good side of the lake, and had made peace, a long time ago, with exactly what kept both of those things comfortable. It was, in its own ugly way, a perfect system. Small enough to stay under the radar of state investigators, profitable enough to be worth protecting, and built entirely on the assumption that the people it targeted would never have the power, the money, or the standing to fight back. That assumption was about to be tested. On a bright Tuesday morning in early October, a black SUV came down Route 9 doing exactly the speed limit, driven by a man who had spent the last 11 months living inside the file on Colter Falls Police Department like it was a second home. His name was Calvin Ashford. He was 51 years old, 6'2", built lean rather than bulky, with close-cropped gray hair at the temples and the kind of stillness in his face that made people either trust him instantly or feel, without knowing why, that they were being read. He had been a special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation for 23 years, the last 9 of them inside the Civil Rights and Public Corruption Unit, and in that time he had walked into more small towns like Colter Falls than he could count on both hands. Towns that looked peaceful from the highway and rotten underneath, the way a beautiful apple can be soft and brown at its core. He had not come to Colter Falls by accident. 11 months earlier, a complaint had landed on a desk 3 states away. A young woman named Priya Nankarni, driving home from a wedding, stopped on Route 9 for what the report called a suspicious lane deviation, searched, and relieved of $4,000 in wedding gift cash that she never saw again. Her complaint alone might have gone nowhere, but it landed on top of 6 others, filed over 4 years, from drivers who had passed through Colter Falls and left lighter than they arrived. Different names, different states, the same shape of story, over and over, like a fingerprint the department didn't know it was leaving behind. Ashford's unit had spent months building a quiet case file before anyone in Colter Falls ever knew they were being watched. Financial records pulled through federal subpoenas. Patterns in seizure data that no honest department could explain. A confidential source inside the county courthouse, who had grown a conscience after watching one too many warrants get rubber-stamped. By the time Ashford drove into town that October morning, he already knew more about Chief Roy Danvers's bank accounts than Danvers's own wife did. But knowing wasn't enough. Ashford needed to see it, not read about it in a spreadsheet. See the department do, to a total stranger, exactly what it had been doing for years. He needed a target the department would never suspect, and he intended to be that target himself. He wore an ordinary gray sport coat over a plain white shirt. His SUV was a rental, registered to a shell name his unit used for exactly this kind of work. In the locked case in the back seat sat two laptops, a folder of sealed federal documents, and a badge that, if anyone in Colter Falls had known it was there, would have made every one of them run for the county line. Officer Wade Tolliver was parked in his usual spot that morning, tucked behind the leaning red barn a quarter-mile past the Colter Falls welcome sign, engine off, radar gun resting on his knee, 3 coffees deep and bored out of his mind. He watched the black SUV come around the bend, well under the limit driven, with the kind of careful, unhurried calm that Tolliver, in 11 years of profiling drivers for a living, had learned to associate with exactly one kind of person, someone with nothing to hide and, in his mind, nothing to fight back with. He pulled out behind it before it even passed the church. "Dispatch, this is Unit 4. I've got a black Tahoe, out-of-state plates, headed south on Route 9, initiating a stop." He hadn't seen a single traffic violation. He didn't need one yet. He would find one on the way. Calvin Ashford watched the lights fill his mirror and felt nothing you could call surprise. He signaled early, well before he needed to, pulled onto the wide gravel shoulder with the deliberate slowness of a man who had trained 100 younger agents on exactly this moment, and put both hands on the wheel where they could be seen. He had done this before, on both sides of the badge. He knew precisely how many seconds mattered. Tolliver approached the driver's side with the walk he used for out-of-towners, shoulders back, chin up, thumbs hooked near his belt, close enough to the window to make his presence felt before he said a word. "License and registration." "Good morning, officer." Ashford's voice was even, unhurried, almost warm. "Can I ask what the stop is for?" "Failure to maintain your lane back there by the church," almost drifted into the shoulder. It was a lie, and both men in that moment knew only one of them knew it. "I don't believe I did that, officer, but I understand you have to make the stop either way. License is in my wallet, registration's in the glove box. I'm going to reach for them slowly, that all right?" Tolliver's eyes narrowed slightly. Most men he stopped either argued immediately or went silent with fear. This man did neither. He spoke like someone reading from a manual only he had access to, and something about that calm, that total absence of the tremor Tolliver was used to hearing, needled at him in a way he didn't like. "You're not from around here," Tolliver said, taking the license and barely glancing at it. "No, sir, just passing through." "Where you headed?" "South." "That's not an answer. It's the answer to the question you asked." Something tightened behind Tolliver's jaw. He had built an entire career on being the most powerful man in any conversation he started, and this stranger, this calm black man in an ordinary rental SUV, was not playing his part in the script. "Step out of the vehicle." "Can I ask the reason?" "I said step out of the vehicle." Ashford stepped out. He moved without a flicker of anger, without the defensive stiffness that Tolliver had learned to enjoy provoking, and stood on the gravel shoulder with his hands loosely folded in front of him, watching the officer with the patient attention of a man observing a specimen through glass. "I'm going to search your vehicle," Tolliver announced. "On what grounds?" "I smell marijuana." "There's no marijuana in that vehicle, officer, and I'd ask you to be careful about the grounds you put in your report because I promise you it will be read very closely." That should have been the moment a smarter man stopped. It was not the moment Wade Tolliver stopped. It was the moment Wade Tolliver decided this stranger needed to be taught a lesson about who was in charge of this stretch of road. "You threatening me?" "I'm informing you." Tolliver keyed his radio without breaking eye contact. "Dispatch, requesting backup on Route 9, quarter-mile south of the church. Uncooperative subject." Ashford had not raised his voice, had not raised a hand, had not moved a muscle that could reasonably be called uncooperative, and both of them knew it. But the word went out over the radio anyway, because in Colter Falls, uncooperative simply meant a driver who had not yet learned to be afraid. Two more cruisers arrived within 4 minutes. One carried a heavy-set older officer named Griggs, a Danvers loyalist since the day he was hired, the kind of cop who had stopped asking questions around year 2 of his career and never started again. The other carried a much younger officer, 26 years old, barely 18 months on the job, a soft-faced kid named Danny Prout, who still wrote his reports the way the academy taught him to, and had not yet learned that Colter Falls had its own unwritten version of the manual. Prout stood a little apart from the others, watching the scene with the specific unease of someone whose stomach understands something is wrong before his mind is ready to admit it. Griggs popped the SUV's rear hatch without asking. Tolliver leaned into the back seat. And there, tucked beneath a folded jacket, sat the locked federal case, matte black, reinforced, with a keypad lock and a small embossed seal that Tolliver didn't recognize and didn't care to. "What's in the case?" "Officer, I need you to leave that alone." "That's not how this works." Tolliver hauled it out onto the gravel, set it down, and crouched to try the latches. "You got something to hide, we're gonna find it. That case is federal property. I am asking you formally on the record to step away from it." Something in the phrase federal property should have landed like a struck bell. Instead, it landed like static, because men who have spent a decade believing they are untouchable rarely hear the one sentence that should stop them cold. Tolliver pried at the latch with his baton twice. Hard enough that the seal cracked, and for one long second every officer on that shoulder, Griggs with his bored contempt, Prout with his rising dread, Tolliver with his righteous fury, stood frozen, staring down at what the case had opened just enough to reveal. A slim gray folder, stamped across the top in block federal lettering, Department of Justice, Civil RIGHTS Division, sealed. Beneath it, the edge of a second folder marked FBI Public Corruption Task Force, COLTER-FALLSPD, confidential. And beneath that, half visible, a leather case holding a badge that caught the morning light just enough to be unmistakable for what it was. The silence on that gravel shoulder lasted maybe 4 full seconds. It felt, to every man standing there, like considerably longer. "That's not yours to open," Ashford said, and something had changed in his voice. It was not louder, it was not angrier. It had simply become the voice of a man who no longer needed to be patient, because the moment he had spent 11 months waiting for had just arrived on schedule. "You just broke the seal on an active federal investigation into public corruption inside your own department, Officer Tolliver. You did that in front of 3 witnesses, on a road you used to rob travelers, 30 minutes after fabricating probable cause for a stop that never had cause to begin with. I want you to think very carefully about what you say next, because everything from this point forward becomes part of a federal record. You're bluffing." Tolliver's voice had gone thinner. "You're some Fed playing dress-up. Nobody sends a Special Agent Calvin Ashford. Federal Bureau of Investigation, Civil Rights and Public Corruption Unit." He reached slowly into his jacket and produced the credential wallet himself now, holding it open at eye level, steady, unhurried, giving every man on that road the full 3 seconds they needed to understand exactly what they were looking at. "I have been investigating this department for 11 months. I have bank records tracing seized cash from traffic stops into an account tied to your mayor's campaign fund. I have a witness list from 4 states. I have Chief Danvers's financial ties to Ridge Line Towing documented back 6 years. And as of 30 seconds ago, I have you on tape, tearing open a federal case containing sealed grand jury materials without a warrant, without cause, and without the faintest idea what you were about to find." Griggs took a full step backward, his hand drifting away from his belt like it had suddenly become something he was afraid to be seen wearing. Prout, to his credit, did not move at all. He simply stood there, pale, staring at Tolliver like a man watching a building he'd lived in his whole life quietly begin to collapse. Tolliver's mouth opened and nothing useful came out of it. "I didn't. This was a routine stop. I had reason to believe. You had a system," Ashford said. "You had 11 years of picking targets you assumed would never fight back. You picked wrong today, officer. You didn't stop a victim. You stopped the investigation that was always going to end your department, and you handed it the last piece of evidence it needed with your own hands on camera." He turned, calm as ever, and lifted his phone. "This is Ashford. I'm on Route 9, half a mile south of the Colter Falls town line. I need the task force rolling now. Bring the warrants." What happened over the next 6 hours in Colter Falls would be talked about in that town for the rest of its history, the way people talk about a flood or a fire. A single day that split the town's story cleanly into before and after. Within 90 minutes. 4 unmarked federal vehicles and 2 state police cruisers rolled down Main Street and turned into the parking lot of the Colter Falls Police Department. A squat brick building with a flagpole out front and a hand-painted sign reading "Protect and Serve" that none of the agents walking toward the front door found particularly funny anymore. Ashford was among them, badge now clipped openly to his belt, folder of federal warrants under his arm, walking with the unhurried pace of a man who had earned the right to take his time. Chief Roy Danvers was behind his desk when they came through the door, a cup of coffee halfway to his mouth, a framed photo of himself shaking hands with a state senator hanging crookedly on the wall behind him. He stood up fast enough to knock his chair back. "What in God's name is this?" "Chief Danvers." Ashford set the folder on the desk between them, unhurried. "Federal warrant for your arrest on charges including deprivation of rights under color of law, racketeering, wire fraud, and money laundering. We have 6 years of financial records connecting seized traveler funds to your account at Ridge Line Towing, routed through the Colter Falls Community Safety Foundation, and from there into Mayor Calloway's campaign accounts. We have testimony from 4 states. We have your own officer, 40 minutes ago, illegally opening a sealed federal case on a public road." Danvers's face went through 3 distinct colors in about as many seconds: the flushed red of outrage, the gray of understanding, and finally something closer to white. "You don't know what you're doing. I've got friends at the state level. You had friends," Ashford said. "As of about an hour ago, most of them are being interviewed by other agents in other rooms, and I promise you, Chief, they are far more interested in saving themselves than saving you." They walked him out through the front door in handcuffs past the flagpole, past the hand-painted sign into the gray afternoon light, and it seemed to every person watching from the sidewalk that the town itself had gone quiet to witness it. The fall of a man who had ruled Colter Falls like a small-town king for 16 years reduced, in the space of a single morning, to a mugshot and a case number. Officer Wade Tolliver was arrested that same afternoon, charged with fabricating probable cause, illegal search, deprivation of rights under color of law, and obstruction, his own dashcam and bodycam footage from that morning becoming, ironically, the federal government's single most valuable piece of evidence against him. Officer Griggs was arrested 2 days later on similar charges, once agents finished combing through 6 years of his stop reports, and found a pattern of targeted, race-based traffic stops so consistent it was almost mathematical. Inside the interview rooms the federal task force had set up in a borrowed wing of the county, building the officers who had spent years enforcing Chief Danvers's system, began one by one to tell very different versions of the same story than the ones they'd been telling each other for years. Griggs sitting across from 2 federal agents with a lawyer he couldn't really afford beside him, spent the first hour insisting he had just been following orders, and the second hour trying to explain that following orders was exactly the defense his own department had taught him would never hold up in a courtroom. He gave up Danvers's instructions almost word for word, once he understood that the alternative was carrying the full weight of the scheme alone. A second, lower-ranking officer, hoping for leniency, produced a phone full of text messages joking about which stretch of Route 9 was good hunting on a Friday afternoon, and which out-of-state plates were the safest bets. Piece by piece, the wall of silence that had protected Colter Falls for years came apart from the inside, each man racing to be the first to cooperate rather than the last to be believed. Officer Danny Prout was not arrested. Within 48 hours he had walked, on his own, into the temporary field office the FBI had set up at the Colter Falls Grange Hall, and asked to speak to Agent Ashford directly. "I need to tell you what I've seen," Prout said, sitting across a folding table in a room that still smelled faintly of old coffee and floor wax. "I need to tell you everything." Over the following 2 weeks, Prout's cooperation became one of the most important threads in the entire case. He had kept things quiet, private things, the way a young man keeps a diary he's ashamed to admit he's writing. Photographs of seizure logs that never matched what actually got returned to owners. Text messages from Griggs joking about easy pickings on Route 9. A recording, made almost by accident on his own phone during a slow shift, of Chief Danvers explaining to a new hire exactly how the towing arrangement with Curtis Boone worked, and exactly how much of the auction proceeds came back around to the foundation. That recording alone was enough to bring down 2 more people. Curtis Boone, owner of Ridge Line Towing and Recovery, was arrested for his role in the auction scheme. The federal case laying out in exhausting detail how vehicles seized from travelers were routinely sold below market value to buyers who turned out to be Boone's own relatives and associates, who then quietly resold them for full price, the difference funneled back into the same accounts that fed Danvers. The mayor and the department itself. Mayor Denise Calloway held a press conference on the courthouse steps 4 days after Danvers's arrest, dressed in the kind of somber navy blazer that political consultants recommend for exactly this occasion, insisting she had no knowledge whatsoever of any wrongdoing inside the department she had overseen for 12 years. It might have worked if federal investigators hadn't already obtained 3 years of campaign finance records showing recurring transfers from the Colter Falls Community Safety Foundation directly into her re-election fund, transfers she had personally signed off on receiving. The press conference that was supposed to save her career instead became, within a week, the centerpiece of her own indictment on charges of wire fraud and conspiracy. Judge Preston Hale's role took longer to fully surface, buried as it was in years of court filings that looked, on their surface, entirely routine. But once federal auditors began comparing the average time Hale spent reviewing search warrants and forfeiture petitions from the Colter Falls Police Department against every other jurisdiction in the state, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Warrants that should have taken careful review were signed in minutes. Forfeiture petitions with almost no supporting evidence were rubber-stamped without a single question. Hale was removed from the bench pending investigation, and 3 months later, indicted on charges connected to his role in enabling the department's illegal seizure operation. County Prosecutor Ray Vance resigned the week the story broke nationally, before charges were even filed against him, in what his lawyer publicly called a voluntary step to allow the investigation to proceed without distraction. Investigators had a different word for it. They called it consciousness of guilt. The story of Colter Falls did not stay a local story for long. Within 10 days, it was national news. A small mountain town where a single traffic stop had unraveled a corruption network that stretched from the police department all the way to the mayor's office and the judge's bench. Reporters descended on Main Street. Camera crews stood outside the police department, now boarded and dark, its badge and patches quietly retired by the state, its remaining honest officers reassigned under the supervision of a state police oversight unit sent in to run the town's law enforcement until new leadership could be vetted and installed. But the part of the story that stayed with people, the part that got shared and quoted and replayed, was not the arrests. It was the woman who finally got her wedding money back. Priya Nadkarni had been 26 years old when Officer Tolliver stopped her on Route 9, driving home from her cousin's wedding, with $4,000 in cash gifts, folded carefully in an envelope in her glove box. Money meant to help her and her new husband make a down payment on their first apartment. Tolliver had found the envelope during an inventory search that followed a stop for a lane violation that never happened, and the money had vanished into the department's forfeiture system, never to be seen again, despite months of calls, letters, and a lawyer she couldn't really afford. She testified before a federal grand jury 11 months after that stop, describing, in a voice that shook only slightly, what it felt like to be treated like a criminal for the crime of driving home from a family wedding while brown. When the jury returned indictments against Danvers Tolliver, Griggs Boone Calloway, and Hale on charges spanning civil rights violations, racketeering, wire fraud, and money laundering, Priya was sitting in the gallery, and it was reported afterward that Agent Ashford had made a point of walking over to her personally, before speaking to a single reporter, to tell her that her money, with interest, would be returned in full along with a formal federal restitution order covering every dollar the department had stolen from travelers across 4 years. She was not the only one. Federal investigators eventually identified 31 separate victims of Colter Falls' forfeiture scheme from 6 different states and secured restitution orders for every single one of them. Some of the money had been sitting untouched in frozen accounts the whole time. Some had to be clawed back from Curtis Boone's towing business and auction proceeds. All of it eventually made its way home. The trial itself, when it finally came, 8 months later, filled the county courthouse to capacity every single day. Chief Danvers, who had walked into that courtroom on the first day, still wearing the confident posture of a man who believed connections, would save him sat by the final week of testimony with his shoulders permanently slumped, watching prosecutors lay out piece by piece. 6 years of financial records that left no room left for doubt or deniability. Officer Tolliver's own bodycam footage from the morning of the stop was played for the jury in full, his voice fabricating probable cause in real time, his hands tearing open a sealed federal case in real time, and by the time the recording ended, several jurors were visibly openly shaking their heads. When the sentences came down, they came down heavy. Danvers received 18 years for racketeering, wire fraud, and conspiracy. Tolliver received 11 years for civil rights violations and obstruction, the judge in his case noting for the record that an officer who fabricates the very cause for a stop poisons the foundation of the badge he wears. Griggs received 9 years. Curtis Boone received 7 for his role in the fraudulent auction scheme. Judge Hale, in a moment that drew audible gasps from the courtroom gallery, was sentenced to 12 years for his role, enabling the department's illegal seizures. The presiding federal judge remarking that a judge who abandons scrutiny for convenience does more damage to the rule of law than any officer on the street ever could. Mayor Denise Calloway received 6 years for wire fraud and conspiracy, her political career, once the pride of Colter Falls' Main Street storefronts, reduced in a single sentencing hearing to a footnote in a federal case file. At the sentencing hearing, Priya Nadkarni was given the chance to speak, and she stood in front of the same courtroom that had once treated her like a suspect and told Chief Danvers directly that his department had not just stolen her money, it had stolen her sense of safety on every road she had driven since. "You thought you were catching criminals," she said. "You were the only crime on that road." Officer Danny Prout was never charged. His cooperation, and the evidence he had quietly preserved out of a conscience the rest of his department had long since abandoned, was cited by federal prosecutors as instrumental to the case. He resigned from the Colter Falls Police Department the week the investigation became public, and 2 years later, after completing additional training, he was hired onto a state police unit built specifically to audit small-town departments for exactly the kind of abuse he had once been too afraid to report. He said in the only interview he ever gave about it that he thought about that morning on Route 9 almost every day, and that the moment he understood what he was watching, the moment Agent Ashford opened that credential wallet, was the moment he decided he never wanted to be the kind of officer who needed a federal agent to remind him what the badge was actually for. The Colter Falls Police Department, as it had existed for 16 years under Chief Danvers, ceased to exist entirely. The state dissolved it 8 months after the arrests and folded the town's law enforcement into a regional department under direct state oversight, with new hiring standards, mandatory bodycam audits, and an independent civilian review board with actual power to investigate complaints. The very kind of oversight that, had it existed a decade earlier, might have stopped the entire scheme before it ever started. Special Agent Calvin Ashford did not stay in Colter Falls for the trial's final verdict. By the time the jury returned, he was already 3 states away, driving another quiet highway through another small town that had shown up in some other agent's file as a pattern that didn't add up. That was the part of the job most people never saw. Not the badge reveal, not the raid, just a man in a gray sport coat driving the speed limit, watching the road, waiting to see if this town too would show him who it really was. He thought sometimes about that morning outside the church, about the exact moment Wade Tolliver had looked at him and decided, instantly, without evidence, without a single fact to support it, that here was a man who could be pushed around and would simply take it. It was the same mistake Ashford had watched 100 corrupt officers make over 23 years, in 100 different towns, and it never stopped being the mistake that undid them, because it was never really about the traffic stop. It was about a system built entirely on the assumption that certain people would not fight back, would not know their rights, would not have the standing to make anyone answer for it. And every time that assumption turned out to be wrong, the whole rotten structure built on top of it came down with it. Calvin Ashford believed, and had believed for 23 years, that the badge only meant something if the person wearing it remembered what it was for. Every town he drove into was a test of that idea. Colter Falls had failed it as completely as any town he had ever seen. But Priya Nankarni had her money back, with interest. Danny Prout was out there now doing the job the right way. And somewhere behind him, in a courthouse that would carry the memory of that trial for a generation, 12 honest jurors had looked at 6 years of stolen paychecks and stolen dignity, and said plainly that it would not stand. He drove on south, toward whatever came next, calm as ever, because he knew there would always be another road, another town, another badge that had forgotten what it was supposed to protect. And he knew, with the same quiet certainty that had carried him through that gravel shoulder outside the church, that he would be ready for it, every single time. If this story hit you the way it hit me writing it, do not just scroll past it. Hit that like button right now, because it tells this channel that stories like this, stories about ordinary people who turn out to be anything but powerless, stories about corruption that finally meets its match, are exactly what you want to see more of. Drop a comment and tell me which moment got you the most. The badge reveal on that gravel shoulder, the chief walking out of his own station in handcuffs, or Priya finally getting her money back after everything that town put her through. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that the truth always finds its way to the surface, no matter how deep somebody tries to bury it. And if you want more stories like this one, stories of justice, of badges that get put in their place, of the powerless turning out to be the most powerful people in the room, subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell, because there is always another story like Colter Falls waiting to be told. And I promise you, you do not want to miss the next one.